Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Michele Heyward, and we're here for another episode of Built by Women. If you don't know what Built by Women is, it is truly a conversation by women in infrastructure who are telling their stories and about their work history, as well as the things they do in architecture, engineering, and construction industry. And today we have a fantastic speaker by the name of Jessica Bantom. Jessica is the design DEIB consultant, where she is a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practitioner, an interior design consultant, and a speaker whose mission is to help designers increase their cultural competency so they can create in ways that honor humanity, not people, but humanity. So keep that in mind. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia and Marymount University. She is a skilled management consultant with over 20 years of experience, a compelling speaker, and a certified facilitator and coach with a passion for enabling individuals to take actions that create meaningful outcomes for historically excluded people. Jessica is active in the interior design industry as an interior design and color consultant, and as an engaged advocate committed to promoting DEIB, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the industry and in practice. So I want to say, everybody, welcome to the author of the Design for Identity, How to Design Authority for a Diverse World, Miss Jessica Bantom. How are you doing, Jessica?
I'm great, Michele. Thanks for having me.
I love this. I love how you're tying. You found that gap in interior design and DEIB, we're going to have a conversation, I know, around that. But I want to first ask you, how did you get into interior design?
Yeah, it's interesting. This seems to be a common theme among a lot of people I know in this space. But my mother was in interior design for a while, so I was fortunate enough to have that exposure during my upbringing to interior design as a career field and as a career option overall. So that was always in the back of my mind. It was something that I found interesting. I found really, it was something I was drawn to, and which was also in line with my more kind of creative side. I was always pretty artistic growing up, doing painting and drawing and things like that. So design just seemed like something that to me felt like something that kind of fed my creative side. But it's interesting. I liked design. I appreciated interior design, but I didn't see it as a stable career or stable industry, because also during my upbringing, we experienced the market crash in the 80s, and design was a field that was hit hard by that. And that actually ended my mother's time in that field. So that kind of made me a little leery about pursuing it as a career. But once I went through undergrad, got out in the world, started doing some work in marketing, and then got into IT consulting, I started rethinking my decisions. And, it came to me that maybe I should have pursued design because it was something that really did fuel my passion. And it was something that I was really drawn to. And it gave me that kind of creative outlet. So it was when I was a few years out from undergrad that I decided to go back and get my degree in interior design.
I love it. I love how you said that. Um, so everybody, if you still have that hankering, it's something that you want to go after. We've been seeing stories over the last 10 years, people in their 70s and 60s getting their degree, graduating with their children and grandchildren. So it is not necessarily impossible. And I always think back to this conversation with a professor, and he talks about how he had a student who said she had gotten her associate's degree, and he was like, you should go get your bachelor's degree. And she was like, I work full time, I have a family, it'll take me 4 years to get a bachelor's degree. he said, well, one thing is for sure, the 4 years will come. Will you have a bachelor's degree or not is the question to answer. And so you don't have to go at the same pace as everybody. You're definitely going to come in more focus and knowledge usually. So definitely think about what it is. And maybe it's not a degree. Maybe you want to be a race car driver. I don't know. But whatever that thing is, definitely don't give up on it. So now, just a little bit of inspiration because I love that. So as you're going through interior design, like you're like, okay, this is what I really want to do. What was your experience in the industry, uh, in the industry that led? Because I want to get to the DEIB part. Like, what is it like in that industry first, and what was your experience in the industry thus far?
Got it. So it was interesting being in the classroom. I have to say, like as I mentioned, I had started my career and I was in IT consulting at the time that I decided to go back for my degree in interior design. So I was used to being in spaces where I was sometimes the only woman, sometimes the only person of color. But then it wasn't completely different going into the classroom for an interior design program because I was one of few people who looked like me in the class. Now, granted, there were more women, but there weren't that many people of color. But it was interesting because even when I went from the classroom to getting involved with professional associations and different industry events, I was one of even fewer people in the room who looked like me. And I found that to be kind of, well, number one, kind of uncomfortable, as anybody could probably relate to when you're in a space where there aren't many other people like you. So just by virtue of that fact alone, that makes you feel a little kind of out of place. But then it was also magnified in places like the design centers and showrooms, where I walked into those spaces and was given the kind of like once over, the look up and down, like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. So I kind of got used to not feeling welcomed in most spaces that I was in when it came to design. That's not a good thing. I don't say that to say that it's a good thing, but it seemed to be the norm in my typical kind of experience at different spaces. And that to me was jarring just from the fact that, I was wondering how many more of us would be in these places and then take ourselves out of it because we don't feel like we belong there and we don't feel like we have a space. I was at the very beginnings of my career in design, and if I was having those feelings that early on, I could only imagine that contributed to the fact that I wasn't seeing many more of us in the spaces when I started getting into, as I mentioned, more kind of industry events and professional environments, and that did disturb me. But the importance or the impact of that wasn't really as clear to me as it was when I started getting into my work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And then it started growing me in a different way. Just the fact that there was so little diversity in the profession seemed like a big disconnect when you look at the fact that designers design for everybody. So we design for a diverse population, but we don't have that same lived experience. We don't have that same representation in the profession itself, which to me just automatically sent up a red flag that most of what we do as design professionals is likely to be performative for that reason.
Thank you for pointing that out, that the lack of diversity oftentimes leaves gaps and issues. Something that always comes to mind as a civil engineer, because I'm not always looking at how it looks. Like, does it function? Does it stand up and not endanger the lives of other people? But being physically able and how able-bodied people often design and then retrofit for those who are not able-bodied, that are disabled. And when people started pointing that out, I was like, or why do we have to have websites that are for people that are visually impaired? But you think about how then you are excluding people and how you've been trained to exclude people because they were never involved in the process at all in developing standards and processes and procedures. So thank you for tying that in. So as you're in the industry and you're seeing that things are being designed in one way or not inclusive, what have you seen as some of the biggest gaps in interior design when it comes to the work that is being done?
Yeah, well, I would say that some of the gaps, the origin of some of the gaps, I will say, probably goes back to design education. Because just like you were saying, there aren't usually people of different identities or multiple or diverse identities in the design process itself. So they're just kind of guessing at what's important for other people and trying to put themselves in, in other people's shoes, or, trying to recreate their experience when you can't do that. So I started seeing that in the classrooms, in our courses, where we never touched on a broad range of identities in the course of completing our studios and working on our projects. The most that we would get into usually was around accessibility. But even to that point, it wasn't like we were talking to people who had to move through space as a disabled person. So it was still that idea of, well, let's just imagine, what if you were in a wheelchair? And even at that, when we talked a lot about ability, it was usually about mobility, as opposed to the wide range of disabilities that there are, from cognitive to all the other ways that people can be disabled. So just in general, like, our scope was very narrow when it came to being inclusive, or, conducting universal design that honestly wasn't really universal. So that's always been, to me, like a huge gap. And that's one I'm actually getting the opportunity to address myself, because now I am in the classroom. I've actually just started teaching a course based on my book to university students in interior design, to help them to design for identity. But that I see that education, once again, I said, is being the starting point. This is, to me, where we get the impressions of what's important in design. Like, what are the critical foundational things you need to know as a designer? And if we don't teach it there, then we're sending that signal that being inclusive doesn't really matter, quite honestly. And then to get into practice and see that things aren't that different. That maybe when we engage with customers, typically it's at the beginning, very beginning, maybe, of the design process, to get some initial requirements, to get some initial insights, and then we generally don't connect with them again until the end, when we're probably at about the 90% mark, where it's, quite honestly, too expensive and too late to make any drastic changes based on customer feedback at that point anyway. So this just seems to be like standard practice. Now, of course, I am generalizing, but this just seems to be like the common experience in terms of how identity is not addressed, and how diverse identities are not typically addressed in practice.
And also, like you said, usually when things are identified, it's so late in the process, people then say, well, we don't have time or money to address that. We'll do it in a different funding round, or they know it won't pass code, so then they'll address it because they can't proceed without it. And so we're only meeting the requirements that are legally binding, as opposed to, as you said, that are really humane. You had humanities that are really humane for everybody. We had a really great, we had a comment, true, there's so much mess when people are left out of spaces. Absolutely. So we talked about disabled people as far as interior design. Are there other people, especially in marginalized communities, underserved communities, that are left out in design as well?
Well, I think that we are just not making space to explore identities of people in general. Just as I mentioned, we may address ability, but even in that instance, it's usually just surface level. Like, we may get some stats on a particular population and think, oh, well, we need to accommodate, just like you mentioned, people with certain, usually visually identified disabilities.
Yep.
And by doing that, once again, we are guessing at what's really relevant to people. And we're also limiting what we know because we're not creating space for the conversations. So to me, what's really key in making sure that people are included, it is actually including them, like sitting down, having the conversations, and as part of the beginning of a design process, asking, what about your identity would you like to see celebrated in this space? So creating that opportunity for people to self-identify, and to, to contribute and be forthcoming about what is really critical to them to incorporate and to design around, and not just to accommodate, because saying accommodate to me makes it sound like you're doing somebody a favor, but to really embrace what those elements of their identity are. And that could be anything from their religious practices, to their racial or ethnic background, to age and different factors that are related to that. That there's just so much more that makes us who we are. And that's part of the issue, is that when we talk about inclusive or universal design, generally, the scope is just so narrow that we're not even creating space for conversation about anything else, about people's lifestyles or how they show up in the world and what they would like to see of themselves actually reflected in what's being designed for them.
Oh, you said so many great things in there. Visually seeing if people are disabled, but how do they show up in the space is really, really important. When we take that viewpoint of how do they show up, something that comes to mind, I never, you may be seeing the warnings now, like, hey, we have a lot of flashing lights and what impact that has on people. And oftentimes we think everybody, or oftentimes we assume everybody's having a similar, the same experience as us, and it can be completely different. As we've gotten older, we may find that we enjoy quiet as opposed to loud sounds. Or people we talk about during the holidays, 4th of July or Independence Day here in the US, and on a New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, fireworks, and how there's pets as well as veterans and other people who you can't necessarily tell, but their experiences are different. And so, how do we accommodate, not even like you said, accommodate, but how do we be inclusive of their needs? So, thank you for pointing those out. So, it's not universal. Universal design is one thing, inclusive design is something else, which I appreciate. So, now that I want to move over to your book. As you mentioned, you're teaching a course about your book. Can you share a bit about the book and why you wrote it?
Sure. So the book is called Design for Identity, How to Design Authentically for a Diverse World. And it's essentially kind of a how-to for designers to intentionally incorporate identity and address it throughout the design process, to ensure that they are engaging with customers and really finding out and making space for conversations about what is critical to them about their identities to incorporate into the design. The book really came from a lot of feedback or a lot of questions I was getting in my work as a DEI practitioner about what can I do differently, especially after the summer of 2020. I think a lot of people had their own awakenings about social justice and racial justice, and I think that kind of spilled over into a lot of things when it comes to talking about difference in culture and identity. And I think there are a lot of people out there with good intention, but they're not sure what to do with it. Like, they want to know, how do I show up differently? What can I do, in the context of this book? What can I do differently as a designer to show that I do honor, I do value diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they just really don't know what to do differently. So that was, to me, that was an important need to fill, because I wouldn't want that passion to just dwindle because people just really never got any instruction about what to do differently. And I am just more kind of action focused in my approach to DEI anyway. I wouldn't want it. I think of like a kind of parallel scenario where if you went to the doctor and they told you that your blood pressure was too high, and then they just sent you on your way, as opposed to telling you that and then giving you maybe a new meal plan that would actually equip you to do something differently to make the changes. That's how I approach DEI. I want to give people guidance to start making changes right now that will bring about positive impacts for historically excluded people. So what I get to in the book is, I get into a lot about the different factors that make cultural competence important for designers. And cultural competence is the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from different backgrounds than your own. I think that's one of the major missing things in the practice of design. We can talk about difference all day. We can talk about DEI all day. But if we don't activate that, if we don't activate those values of diversity, equity, inclusion, if we don't really start having the conversations that we've been tiptoeing around forever because they were uncomfortable, or we didn't think we weren't forced or accountable for having them, nothing's going to change if we just stay in that mode. So a lot of the book is about getting in that space and recognizing and leaning into the importance of cultural competence for designers, and then showing up as a culturally competent designer. And culturally competent designers are the ones who are willing to open that conversation with their customers and even with their colleagues about the importance of lived experience and the importance of getting perspectives from people from marginalized backgrounds to inform our design. And that's another, like I said, a huge missing piece of what the practice has been up till now.
Oh, it's so because I'm sitting here and everything you're saying as a civil engineer, and I was not on the design side, but I can see where your book is not only for interior designers, but I think as civil engineer or just engineers that do design work, the importance of reading it so they have a better understanding. And as you include in your book, a framework that they can utilize when they're doing their design work. I come out of utilities, but the assumption is it's a power pole and it's going, we just needed to do this, but is there something different we can do even with the foundations or with a fossil fuel plant? Is there something we can do with the colors and different things of the paint on the outside of the buildings as well? So I push and encourage everybody, really, even automotive interior design. How can you utilize the book for that? Because let's be honest, the automotive industry and the industry that tracks injuries and deaths in vehicles have proven that vehicles are not designed for women. They're designed for the safety wise, they're not designed for people under 5'5". So most women are under 5'5". And so what that does is, how do you take it? And I encourage you in different industries, really, that still do design work, to really read Jessica's book so that you can understand how to take the same principles outside of maybe interior design of a home or a building, because it still has impact on people. And what does that look like for that particular industry?
I appreciate you making that point too, because my background is in interior design, but the book is written to apply across all design disciplines.
Yes.
So I don't want anyone to think, you have to just have that interior design background, or it's only written through that lens. It is intentionally meant to apply to product design, fashion design, graphic design, all of those, because essentially we are all providing a similar service in essence for people. So the principles are the same.
Absolutely. I think it's on a physical product side, I think people think childproof and how do elderly people get into their medication, right? It's not more than those things. It's around the safety and liability. But there are other reasons to have labels a certain color for people who are colorblind. And people that don't have hands, but they use their feet. Can they still open stuff? And so we really, like you said, your framework really opens us up to really think about how. So all my packaging engineers out there, and somebody like, what is the packaging? They design the packaging on things I'm not So so it's really important, like what, not just a flip cap, but can a flip cap be an open and a screw cap? Is there a third way for somebody to access the contents of a container? And so I really challenge you, like, oh, they don't want to pay for it. Well, how much are they losing in sales because there's only one competitor in the market that's doing it? And everybody buys it because it's the only one, but it tastes the worst.
Right. And you bring up a good point too, because I do want to also add that the benefit of opening the dialogue with your customers is that then it's not on the designers to keep coming up with all of the answers, because ultimately we can only design to the extent of our own experience. So if we open that conversation with customers and say, how do you open this? Or what are different ways what would make this easier for you? They will likely give you so many more answers than you ever could have thought up on your own. And that's part of what I get to in the book too, is just the designers. I think we have a tendency to want to own the solution, or to think that it's all on our shoulders to come up with a solution. It is on our shoulders to execute it, but people are the experts on themselves, and we need to lean into their expertise to inform the design that we create. And that also, like I said, alleviates a lot of pressure from us, quite honestly, because we could sit there and toil and think like, aha, I got it. And then just like you said, it gets out in the market and people are like, I'll pass.
Exactly. We oftentimes, I won't say oftentimes, in certain industries, they were bringing focus groups to test different things and get reactions. In software, we do customer discovery. And so you're looking at how the users, and even on websites, we will track how people are coming through our website, what they're clicking on. But we really, in testing it, how do we do that on the design side with DEIB in mind before you completely build something out and say, oh, we're out of money, we're out of time, we'll catch you next time. And really, I like reframing that from the beginning is really important.
Right. And not testing to confirm our solution, but creating the space for other solutions to be created. I think that's also key. Like that's exactly. One of the critical mindset shifts that needs to happen.
Yes. And just going back to a framework as opposed to these are best practices for who and whom, and who created it, and who was included, who was excluded. Like, why do you have like this? Welcome to customer discovery. Discover what gaps are. So as we're talking to designers, and I say this to party planners and event planners, because I'm designing for this event, like, trust me, somebody there is like, this is not it. And just so all of you that are thinking, oh, well, I don't do it except in the issue 2. If you're coming up with a reason why it's not you, this book is definitely I just want to make that clear.
Yes. And I will say, as in a past life, as someone who was a corporate event planner, we do design experiences.
Yep.
And it's not just about what's pretty. It's about how do people get into the space? How do they navigate it? How do they know what's coming, what's next, where they should be? What is supposed to be your like wow moment? And is that going to be an experience everyone can experience the same way? Exactly. So yeah, it just like you said, if you're questioning it, it probably does apply to you.
Exactly. I've always dreamed of having like a special event on the beach. And it's just like, well, how about people with canes and wheelchairs and kids that like to eat sand and they can't, so somebody got to carry them all the way to and then we got to make sure they don't run into the water. It's like, let's go back to indoors where we can see the ocean on the beach, you know?
Exactly.
It's so you don't take away, and it's a different experience, but it's close enough. And just thinking about who you're inviting to those events, even before you know who's going to accept the invitation, making sure that experience is there. So, okay. I want to ask you one last question. For people that are designing, whether they are professionals in the space, whether they are doing customer discovery for a software product or a physical product, or if they are an interior designer with experience, what are some things you would tell them right now that they need to consider when they're doing design?
I would refer them to the Design for Identity blueprint in the book, because it provides questions to ask throughout the design process. So in virtually every phase of the design process, from that initial information gathering and that initial client contact through to concept development, through testing, um, and actually around the whole circle again when it's time to complete another iteration potentially of a design. Uh, the Design for Identity blueprint does give you those questions to ask, um, as I mentioned, to initiate the conversation with customers about what's important to them to incorporate about their identity, but then also creating opportunities to go back. So once you as a designer have that information and you've processed it and you've come up with a concept, to then go back to the customers and validate it, to ask, have I gotten this right? Are there things I missed out that I left out? Are there things that I misinterpreted? Are there things that I gathered from what you said, but I didn't prioritize them correctly? So maybe, element A is more important than element B, but I made element B the big thing. And then, as I mentioned, then going through once you've got your concept developed, when you're in the final product is in progress, still creating opportunities then to go back and validate and verify. And ultimately, people may ask sometimes, well, isn't this going to make the process more lengthy? Is that going to cost money? Is that going to cost time, et cetera, et cetera? But to me, it's going to save a whole lot of time and money in the long run if what you eventually get to at the 90% mark is not correct, and you have to figure out some way to address that. That can cost you, yes, time and money, but that it can also do damage to your reputation with your customer. It can do damage to even the morale of your team to think that they thought they got it right and now they haven't, and you're going to put a substandard product out into the world. There's just many ways that can go off the rails. So I would propose that Design for Identity blueprint. It's literally a series of questions to ask. And it also, in addition to questions to ask the customers, there are questions to ask internally among your design team. Like, are we gathering all the right perspectives? Are we being intentional about how we're even conducting our research? Are there things that we should go back and verify with our customers, or even go back to them and ask it for their recommendations of resources that we should look into? So it's not prescriptive. It is just creating that space for those types of conversations to happen.
Woo. So go get the book. Jessica, where can people connect with you?
You can connect with me through my website at jessicabantom.com. And I am also active on LinkedIn and Instagram, both at Jessica Bantom. So feel free to reach out. I love having conversations about this. I'd love to hear about designers who are doing this or doing it in different ways. Because to me, the ultimate goal is to make this a normal part of conversation in design spaces.
I love it. I love it. So I'm gonna pop that up on the screen. We'll share also your website, so everybody, anything else you would like to share, because I know you have some things coming up.
Yes. So I do have a couple of events coming up. I will be presenting at the Design Management Institute Design Leadership Conference coming up September 26th through 28th. And also I will be a keynote at High Point Market on October 14th. So those are two events I'm really, really excited about, and would love to see as many people there as possible.
Yes. So Jessica, thank you so much for joining me. Everybody, if you have not, be sure you go over to her website and purchase the book at jessicabantom.com. Connect with Jessica on LinkedIn or follow her on Instagram. Remember, I'm looking for interior design stuff, so I might be over on the gram like, what she got? What's she doing? So make sure you head over there as well. It is so great to have you. We have some people saying hello. We're wrapping up, so I'm hoping you joined us already. If you have any questions, I didn't see any questions in the chat, and I know LinkedIn has been acting a bit funny the last couple of weeks. So I just wanted to make sure I have everything open, but I don't see any questions. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Jessica, again, thank you so much for taking the time going inside the building, because I've been outside, and I don't do the pretty stuff. I focus on the functional stuff. Y'all like roads and clean water and electricity and internet, stuff like that. That part of the architecture, engineering, construction industry. So everybody have a great week, and we will talk to you later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.